Hi, everyone. This is Rob Doggett from the International Yeats Society and the State University of New York at Geneseo. And I'm here today with Ines Bigot. It's nice to see you, Ines. How are you?
Hi, fine. Thank you, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great. And I look forward to seeing you at the International Yeats Summer School in about a month from now. So that'll be a lot of fun. Now you are just finished. You finished up your PhD at the New Sorbonne, and you're taking a position, I understand, a senior lecturer position coming up.
Yes. I've just been appointed as what we call here maître de conférence. So it would be senior lecturer at the University of Toulouse Jean Jaurès.
Oh,
So that
wonderful.
would be a big change for me from Paris to Toulouse, but it's a beautiful city and it's in the south of France. And it's in my specialty, which is quite rare to have the opportunity to have a job on the first year it will be in post-colonial literature. So I will be able to really teach my own topic, which is quite cool, actually.
That's fantastic. And I,
Right.
I know your work a bit from a recent issue of the Journal of International Yeats Studies, where you had a lovely article on fighting the waves, which I thought was just fantastic, and I got to read it several times throughout the process. So I really enjoyed it. And and I know you work a bit on Wole Soyinka, and so what is your current research right now?
Yeah, actually, I've defended my PhD on dance and dissidence in the plays of Wole Soyinka, that Nigerian playwright, and William Butler Yeats in November. And so now I'm still digging. Actually, I'm still reflecting on the poetics and the politics of the dancing body, because I find it to be quite a fascinating topic, and it's really a never-ending process. Actually, when you start to look into those topics. And right now, I'd like to broaden my research in African literature, African studies. So and maybe continue this comparison between Irish literature and Nigerian literature, which works quite well. And I'll be I'll be teaching a course on Yeats and Soyinka. So that's another great opportunity that Toulouse has given me to be able to teach such a comparison. And it's not taken for granted. So it's quite interesting for me. So I'm still, the dancing body and other types of rebellious bodies, actually, and how they work in plays, how they're staged in plays, but maybe try to look beyond drama and explore some of the kinds of genres, such as the novel and poetry. That would be
And that's a nice kind of segue into
challenge.
what we're doing today, because we're talking about A Crazed Girl, which is a poem, as I was saying to you before we started recording. It's not a poem I've looked at in a ton of detail, because it comes in new poems with What Then, which is a famous poem, an important poem, one I always teach, and then Beautiful Lofty Things, which is one of my favorite Yeats poems. And then I was sort of A Crazed Girl. I was like, I kind of skip over that one pretty quickly. So our conversation has given me a chance to look back at it. And I'm actually really excited to hear what you have to say. But why did you choose this particular poem?
Well, I'm not a specialist of Yeats's poetry. I'm a great lover of his poems, of course, but I focus mainly on his drama. But I really love the poems in which he deals with dance, and I think that one is particularly interesting when it comes to reflect on his larger aesthetics of dissidence. So I think it's quite representative of this aesthetics of disunity and dissidence. This is something I've tried to show in my recently published article you mentioned, on fighting the waves. And I think it really represents that celebration of chaos and, disunity, whereas in the scholarship on Yeats, there's a tendency to emphasize the notions of unity and harmony, and to see dance as some kind of symbol. And, most of all, the feminine dancing body is some kind of symbol of harmony, some kind of utopia. And I really do think that, I think this poem helped me go against that kind of generalized tendency to read the dancing body as something cohesive. And actually, it helped me. I think it's the first poem. I hope I'm not, wrong, but I think this is the poem that actually helped me study the plays in the light of those notions of disunity, dissidence, in the etymological sense of sitting apart from something. So the idea of being a rebel a bit. And I think that's the poem that actually started me thinking about that one, and also Sweet Dancer. that are completely different from other poems dealing with dance, such as Among School Children or The Double Vision of Michael Rabati. So yeah, partly for that, and also, well, I love the fact that that poem is a real bundle of contradictions. Actually, it's a hymn to discord to me, because the dancer is a thing and it's contrary at the same time. So it's, and I don't think that the interest is in the fact that she unites contraries. It's more a celebration of discord again. So the fact that she stands on a liminal ground, some kind of impossible made possible. That's an expression that Meg Harper, I really like the expression used in an article she published recently. I think that the article is called Yeats's Transgressive Dancers, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I really do like this idea of dance and discord. And also what I like is, as you said, when I read it the first time, for the first time, I thought about Margot Roddock and, okay, the crazed dance, etc. But it could be read as a misogynistic poem, of course, with the dancer being called a thing. Just that it's a bit problematic. A thing that is completely lost and that is in total lack of control of her own mind, her own body, that is incapable of formulating an articulate discourse. And at the same time, I do think that Yeats, that the dancing body escapes actually the poetic voice in this poem, and that at the very end, it seems that the speaker acknowledges that the dancing body escapes language and presents, more or less implicitly, dance as some kind of positive experience of loss and wandering of the mind and the body. So that's why maybe I like it.
Well, we've got a lot of issues then to talk about as you brought them up, and I think I've been kind of guilty of making the mistake that you were talking about at the start, where when I teach the poems that reference dance and the plays, I'm really quick to go to ideas of unity and harmony and
no, but you're right, because this is part of it.
Yeah, but this is a very different kind of poem, and I think I like the way it complicates, as you're talking about, the complicating how we think about dance, and it also is starting to help me think in different ways about the plays, because when I get to the dance plays, I have trouble talking about the dance itself in the plays, and I'm often at a bit of a loss. And I don't know much. I'm a terrible dancer, and I don't know much about dance. So that's always a sort of moment when I'm like, okay, well, this is sort of representing some kind of unity and transcending language, that sort of stuff, which is really interesting. So we have a lot to talk about. So let's get into it. I'm going to share my screen because if you don't mind, I'd like you to read the poem, and then we'll go through it. So here we go. Here is the poem.
Okay. A crazed girl. That crazed girl, improvising her music, her poetry, dancing upon the shore, her soul in division from itself, climbing, falling, she knew not where, hiding amid the cargo of a steamship, her kneecap broken. That girl, I declare, a beautiful, lofty thing, or a thing heroically lost, heroically found. No matter what disaster occurred, she stood in desperate music wound, and she made in a triumph, where the bales and the baskets lay, no common intelligible sound, but sang, "O sea-starved, hungry sea."
Nice. What an interesting poem.
Yeah. Quite unsettling, actually, when you read it again. I've read it hundreds of times, but it's still quite unsettling.
It is, and it's such a, and knowing a bit about the biography, it's such a really disturbing poem. But we won't talk about the biography at first. Maybe we'll get into that in a biographical information right now. Let's start with that idea of this thing you were talking about before, of the speaker. We have the male speaker looking at the female body, the dancing body, and as we were saying, we often think about that as a symbol of unity or harmony in Yeats, but this is a very different kind of poem here. So maybe if you want to talk about that disharmony in the poem as a starting point there.
Well, yeah, maybe we'd start with this idea of a crazed girl. So she's dancing and she's being observed by a male speaker and a male observer who's trying to describe her.
Mm-hmm.
And so apparently it would seem that he has the upper hand because he's the one who's trying to label her, to describe, to understand. She's the object that's being observed. And you see the structure of the poem. I just look at my book right now. It's made up of two long sentences,
Mm-hmm.
with the poet saying that he declares. So that's some kind of assertion that shows, self-confidence, it seems. And that repetitive determiner, I was wondering about that, that repetitive that twice, that seems to create some distance between the observer and the observed, and of course between us and the poetic voice. So that's, questions that we might ask when, it seems to create some distance. And maybe this has to do with the fact that, the poetic voice has difficulty in describing that girl right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
Because she's precisely not the symbol of unity, but she is chaos itself,
Mm-hmm.
She is climbing and then falling. She is, it's a whole series of oppositions. If you look at that in the second quatrain, there's disaster, desperate, but triumph.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how could a triumph be linked to disaster or despair?
Mm-hmm.
And then this, I think the key to the poem lies here. Heroically lost, heroically found. This kind of oxymoronic, strange, sentence that ends the first set of lines. It's really interesting, that one, heroically lost, heroically found, as though, she was, loss was some kind of way to find liberation. That would be a first key to interpret the dance as something else than just a symbol of unity and harmony. And I really do think that he stages the girl as, experiencing madness. Of course, we're talking about madness here,
Mm-hmm.
but experiencing some kind of liminal, ritualized experience that is at the crossroads between trance, actually ecstasy, and
Mm-hmm.
madness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's true that I think about the plays here because ritual and dance and madness too are often intertwined in Yeats's plays, and you've got this idea of dance as ecstasy, so coming out of your own body and your own mind. And in that perspective, we're going to talk about madness afterwards, but in that perspective, maybe the term shore. Where is that? It's on the second line. The crazed girl improvising in music, poetry, dancing upon the shore. That's, to me, I read it as the kind of spatialization of that liminal space. She's
Mm-hmm.
really standing at the margins of society, of codes, normativity. She's mad, of course. So she's trapped in her own circle, but at the same time, she is in that liminal experience, winding in her own trap, and she's standing at the margins of the world, in her own world of what seems to be some kind of trance, actually, her soul in division from itself.
Mm-hmm.
So of course that could be read as madness, a definition of madness,
Mm-hmm.
the disunity between mind and body. But at the same time, it could also relate to some kind of ritualized experience. I don't know what's your take on this, but considering the interest that Yeats has in ritual and the way he always intertwines it with dance in his plays, but in some other poems,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's quite interesting, to try and go beyond the mad, element.
The notion of madness. And I think it's really interesting as you're talking the outset here that I declare, that's a Yeats,
Oui.
that's so Yeatsian, that sort of moment when we're in a kind of poem that it draws a lot on his own personal life. And then the moment he rises into this position as the public speaker with this kind of assurance where it's like, I declare, but we expect after the declaration something clear and stable.
Exactly.
And instead we get this strange instability, which points to, I think, the liminal moment that you're talking about, like the border between what can be said and what can't be said, what can be known and what can't be known, what can be understood and can't be understood. And I think you're right, it goes well beyond madness. It ties in and reminds me a lot of when he's talking about his occult philosophy and the kind of ritual where we're pushing to something beyond what can be grasped rationally, of course, when he says later the common intelligible sound. I mean, when we think about common, that's often a pejorative in Yeats, but that might be like sort of common, ordinary language. But then even what I think you're getting at is even beyond that, the borders of poetic language and what poetry can and cannot do, and the movement towards a different media of art and what dance can represent. And it's really pushing the boundaries, I think, at all these levels. I mean, as thinking about art and also thinking about ritual and thinking about the occult and thinking about madness and sanity and all of these pushing beyond our desire to declare and to label and to define. As you're talking about it too, it sort of strikes me, that declaration about normalcy, the way that we always want to domesticate the strange and set the boundary between the normal and the abnormal, the sane and the insane, and the way that the poem's like tarrying in that space and our inability to do so. We mentioned the biographical details a little bit. Maybe if you don't mind talking a little bit about Margot Ruddock for people who don't know much of the background about her.
Yes, of course, the poem is inspired by Yeats's relationship with Margot Ruddock, who was a poet and an actress who worked with Yeats on broadcasts of his poetry, and they had a love affair. She was in love with him for a few years, and actually the Crazed Girl, as well as another poem that deals with a theme that's quite close to that, A Sweet Dancer, in the collection. And it's actually an interesting poem when we talk about normalcy and presenting the dancer as some kind of rebel. So Margot Ruddock actually was very hurt by Yeats's words when he suggested that she stop writing poems because, I quote, her technique was getting worse. So, the whole episode was triggered by that. And I don't have the details about the whole episode, but actually The Crazed Girl has been influenced by that. I think he mentions it in a letter to Mrs. Shakespeare. The episode is supposed to have taken place in 36, and the poem dates from, I think, from 38. So we should, look into that. But actually, what's interesting, I think, is that I think it's Elizabeth Cullingford who analyzed their relationship as following, the traditional model of father-daughter relationship with the older world-famous male poet dominating the unstable, unknown female pupil. But what's interesting, I think, is that in this poem, I don't know if Yeats is conscious of it or not, it's the other way around. There's some kind of reversal of the balance of power that might have existed between the two, in the sense that, as you said, the poetic voice pretends that he declares so self-confidence. And as the poem unravels, he actually loses control himself. And that can be seen in the form of the poem itself. A strange sonnet where you have a completely chaotic system of rhymes, with that rhyme, declare and where. And I really agree with you about that declare. I think it's quite interesting. You see that declare rhymes with where. So it's kind of, he declares something that's supposed to be clear, crystal clear and mastered. And at the same time, what he declares is just that he's as much lost as the dancer herself, who doesn't know where she's going. So it's as though he were half admitting that he's searching for the right words. And actually he can't, because all he can say is that this thing is a beautiful, lofty thing. And, to come back to what you said about rationality and the fact that dance escapes that kind of, pre-established pattern, it's interesting because you mentioned the preceding poem in the collection that's called Beautiful Lofty Things. But actually, so in that poem, he enumerates the things, so these are people actually, that he likes and admires. So there's O'Leary, there's his father on the Abbey stage, there's Standish O'Grady, there's Augusta Gregory, Maud Gonne, and he ends the poem with that sentence, a thing never known again. And when I read that, at first I didn't really understand, and I think we can read it as some kind of introduction to A Crazed Girl, thing never known again. Well, the thing might very well be the crazed dance girl, And actually he might have never known really it again, because, you know, dance might, in his place, it's always the same thing. Dance brings some kind of privileged knowledge to the happy few that are able to really have access to it, but without trying to analyze, you know, in a kind of rational way. But maybe he admits himself that he can't really, you know, label it, and so he's still searching. Hence the rhyme, you know, the only rhyme in what could be considered the first two quatrains, if it's a sonnet, you know, where there. So yeah, that's and I think in that way, if we go back to what we were saying about Margot Ruddock and the biographical context, you know, it's as though the crazed girl were taking her own revenge here. You know, the language is invaded by the madness itself, you know, by the chaos of the dancing body. It cannot rhyme, because, you know, it says madness doesn't rhyme. I mean, it doesn't work like this, and it's not an equation. So yeah, this is particularly interesting, that dimension.
I think
yes.
It's interesting when I was looking back at this poem in the context of some of these other ones. So we have What Then, and What Then's, you know, a poem about the individual's attempt, and clearly, you know, speaker in that poem who is a stand-in for Yeats in old age, looking back, you know, going through the progression of his life, and this idea of you know, building towards some kind of unity of being, that one can fashion oneself. And we can think of all these ideas about the mask, et cetera, in Yeats, of this sort of coming into the self, almost as if the self is an art form that can be made and controlled. And what then keeps undercutting that? Like there's still this human desire. We reach a kind of stage of completion, and then we want more, and we keep wanting more. And then in Beautiful Lofty Things, it's almost antithetical, because these are moments in these people's lives of kind of unself-conscious behavior. I mean, they're just these kind of moments with, you know, Standish O'Grady supporting himself between the tables, speaking to a drunken audience, high nonsensical words. Augusta Gregory sitting at her great Armalou table, her 80th winter approaching. Yesterday threatened my life. I told him that nightly from 6 to 7, I sat at this table, the blinds drawn up. Maud Gunn at Hoth Station waiting a train. I mean, these are all these kinds of moments in people's lives that are not that kind of grand self-fashioning where we could declare, okay, that they have become complete, but they're in themselves, in their very sort of ordinariness and messiness of life, a beautiful, lofty thing. So we have these the poems that are like, one about the question of self-fashioning, and the other this kind of unself-conscious expression of something beautiful and lofty, the self become like art, but different from the like well-formed, almost like sculpture that Yeats sometimes longs for. And then a Crazed Girl is so different, because she's linked up with all, in a way, with at the end of Beautiful Lofty Things, it's all the Olympians, a thing never known again. Then we have Margot, this woman who's, you know, she's broken her kneecap, they've had this disastrous relationship where he's clearly after the Steinig procedures, and was, you know, obviously looking for a young woman to sort of, I think, prove to himself that he still had this kind of sexual potency, and this really kind of disastrous, messy relationship that went on. But placing her in that group of the Beautiful Lofty Things, but then not, as you're saying, I think not being able to control what that means, and really struggling with what this dancer sort of represents in this list of the beautiful, lofty things. And so I think as you're talking, maybe think a bit about more broadly Yeats's interest in dance, and the end here, this intelligible sound, and the way that dance can speak. And you know, even when we start using verbs like to speak, I don't even know if that's the right verb for it, but that dance, watching dance evokes sorts of feelings, emotions, and ideas that are that sometimes seem to defy
Mm.
language and defy our control. So I'm wondering how this poem sort of relates to your broader thoughts about the dancing body in Yeats's plays, for example.
I really like what you said about the messiness, because I think it's another word that actually Meg Harper uses in her
Mm-hmm.
very good article on. I think she's focusing mostly on the dance in the poems, but yeah, this idea of messiness, and that's what makes of dance, a triumphant, hence the word triumph, I think, responds to, authoritative normative discourses that try to label, to declare that something is a thing,
Mm-hmm.
trying to make the body a site of inscription rather than a real agent of creativity. But I think what's interesting in that poem, and Yeats is always kind of a bit ironic, about his own trajectory. I think he's, yeah, some kind of what you said about the Olympians. She's supposed to be the symbol of the 15th phase, representing the full moon. If we look at his system of vision, so dance, the perfect body, and the perfect unity of mind and body was
Right.
described, for example, in the second vision of Michael Robartes. So
Mm-hmm.
he talks to us about the Olympians. We might be waiting for some kind of beautiful body, perfect body, like a sculpture, as you said. And here we're facing a girl with a kneecap broken. So she's a broken body, in a broken mind and a broken body, with a broken speech, no common intelligible sound. He doesn't even use the word, but sound, as though, dance was some kind of infra-linguistic form of expression that couldn't reach, articulate discourse, and that was just limited and reduced to the sphere of impulsive feeling.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, he seems to be fascinated by it. And he seems to, well, at the very end, he actually gives up by quoting her. He gives up and he quotes her. So we end the poem with her very own voice. And that's quite interesting because he seemed very self-confident. He kept declaring things and trying to hold on to that, indescribable body and indescribable experience that he's facing. And at the end, even though he said that it was not, a common intelligible sound, he quotes her own words, sea starved, hungry sea, as though it was, that's why I was talking about, maybe think again about the supposedly obvious balance of power between observed and observer here in the poem. I think the determinant that I mentioned earlier, that really points to that. It's as though he couldn't really reach the dance that's actually happening in front of his very eyes. And there's another thing maybe to be related to the relationship between dance and language. Actually, if I try to relate it to what I'm, my own work, what I studied in the plays, when focusing on language and dance, actually what you have in this poem is really the contradictory trajectory that you can find in the plays too, where you have this vision of dance, completely contradictory vision of dance as some kind of beyond of language, some kind of trance-like experience that's close to ritual and that definitely cannot be labeled, and escapes language and thought. And on the other hand, the contrary vision of dance as counter discourse that really functions, dramatically speaking, as an efficient discourse that's really integrated in the play. So, for example, the plays for dancers or the rewritings of the Salome, biblical myth in Full Moon in March, and in The King of the Great Clock Tower, for example, the dance actually is a real counter discourse that the king, unfortunately for him, doesn't really get at first, but it actually literally disarms him at the very end. And even though, if I'm trying to talk about Dance and Madness too, even though the attendants think that her dance and her laughter are proof of her feminine hysteria, they analyze it that way. Yeats shows us that it goes beyond that. It's an ultimate gesture of resistance, and it offers a whole different perception of alterity and a whole different ability to coexist with that alterity that's represented by swineherd. So this is quite a rebellious and strange even discourse to be formulated by a dancer, especially if we think about Yeats's ideas in the late 30s. Well, dance actually has those two. It's presented both ways in his plays, and I think we have that here. He understands it's some kind of language a language that's not common. So maybe it's just that he doesn't have the key to understand that type of language. And so he says it's not intelligible, but he still is trying to understand it as though it were a language. So, it's the same kind of contradiction, but still he doesn't go as far as in the dance plays, because here dance remains at the level of, the problem is that it's an unconscious counter discourse, because it doesn't come from the dancer's intention. And that's the only, difference that we could pinpoint between the poem and the plays. How could it represent a true form of resistance if the dancer itself, is unaware of what? But at the same time, it is.
That's exactly what I was thinking about as you were talking, because I wanted to ask you about that, about agency, and to what extent she has agency in this poem. Because as you're saying, it's sort of there's the element of, we could slot this in with some of Yeats's more, misogynistic kind of art, where he is the one with agency, forming her into symbol, and that's the I declare moment again. But as you're saying, there's a kind of counter discourse at work here, but the counter discourse seems to be in the act of dancing or singing, which curiously then, it removes the sort of complete, to use a lame word, like authentic selfhood, and some kind of idea of like this kind of personal cry. If we had at the end her words, not a song, but like some kind of defiant cry, it'd be a much worse poem, right? But it would also, we could say, oh, like politically, there's the woman speaking back against the controlling author. But instead, her rebellion takes the form of a song, which then renders agency really ambiguous here, and gets at this idea of messiness that you're talking about, that I think makes a lot of sense.
Oh, it's really interesting, the fact that you've got both things. I mean, it's always, that's actually what's great in Yeats, I think, is that there's always the alternative. There's some kind of mastery of the poet, of course, who is the one who has the superiority as the male observer, who's trying to label it. And he's the one who tries to, but at the same time, as you said, it's not an intelligible discourse, and she seems to be trapped at the same time in her own, winding circle. But in a way, her madness is the only way to escape from all the oppressions of the world. So in her madness, in her disaster, she is triumphant. Of course, that could be read as some kind of half dismissive point of view on the part of the speaker, who's allowing her to be able to formulate a discourse that cannot even be understood. So that's a kind of contradictory thing. But there's always the possibility of that madness, that messiness, to contaminate language itself. And that's the thing that I really find it interesting. When you start reading the poem, you see that he's trying to organize, okay, 14 lines is a sonnet, okay, here, but then there's a big problem, because rhyming doesn't work anymore. And this idea also of playing with the tenses, which I think is quite interesting in the poem. He oscillates between a very immediate description of the dance, as though it were, unraveling under our very own eyes, with all these ing forms, improvising her music, dancing upon the shore, climbing, falling, and all of a sudden the apparition of past tenses, knew, occurred, etc., as though that creates some kind of distance again. We don't really know if we're witnessing some immediate experience, or if it's just half dismissive and not that interesting narration or description of a past event. And all those little things contribute to create some distance between the body and us. And I don't read it as, again, a way on Yeats's part to dismiss the dancer and to relegate that body to some form of expression that does not have the right to declare itself as a form of knowledge. But I read it as his own admission. Maybe I'm a bit optimistic, but as his own admission of the unreadability of the dancing body, and that's why I think that the way that he he quotes from a song at the very end is interesting. So of course, it's not a discourse in itself. It's a choreographic, it's a poetic discourse. But I think that Yeats is really much, he really admires that. And this is something that I understood when I looked into his relationship with Ninette de Valois. And he really was fascinated by this possibility of the dancing body to express something, through the body, and not having to have to, the dancing body being able to express many more things than verbal language would. So I really do think that here he, maybe with some kind of irony, but he recognizes, he acknowledges that possibility, even though he's still trying to keep control. And that's something that you can see at several points, especially the declare and the fact that he repeats things. So he relegates her to the realm of things, but that's actually a term that he uses in the preceding poem too. So,
poem, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that what you're saying about the discourses of normalcy, the idea that our attempts to domesticate and define the abnormal and to relegate the body of this woman to some other space that can be defined as unknowable, and yet there's a way that we, in imagining that space as being unknowable, it's an exertion of control. But what you're saying is, in fact, this unknowability is seeping back into the language of the poem, the form of the poem, and disturbing that and destabilizing that. And it's much more about fluidity of bodies, I think, than distancing bodies from bodies. And so it's very powerful and subversive in that sense.
I really do think it's transgressive because of that, because, although that determiner that seems to create distance, it seems that like the crazed girl is contaminating us and him and the language at the same time. So there's this contradictory dynamics of pushing it further, because you're kind of afraid of that unknown, a thing never known again, but maybe he has actually never known it, in his life. He says in a preceding poem in the collection, where is that? Yeah, he says that he's reached 70 years have I lived, and never have I danced for joy. Of course, here it's not really a dance of joy. It's more complicated than this. But maybe he kind of admits here that he doesn't really master that language of dance, even though he tries to, so it's both, the dancing body is both very close to us. It actually contaminates the whole syntax and the language itself of the poet, and very far, because of that strangeness that I think is not to be interpreted, well, it is to be interpreted as, maybe his admission that he cannot understand it, but that's a strength, I think, in itself. And that's always there are both possibilities, and in the plays it's always the same thing. You can read the same poem or the same play in two completely opposed ways, and that's what makes, I think, of the dancing body this dissident potential it has. And the same thing in Sweet Dancer, a few pages before that. Same thing.
Yeah, similar idea.
Crazy. She's supposed to be taken away by, into an asylum. And at the same time, he says, if strange men come from the house to lead her away, but actually it is the dance itself that leads us away from normativity, dissidence, sitting apart. So I think he plays with that. He's playing with, our perception of dance and our perception of what the body is, if we compare it to language. And that idea that the body is supposed to be inferior in terms of, not having the right to reach some kind of knowledge. And, I think it's really, there's a kind of epistemological dissidence that's linked with dance in his plays too, but in his poems. So it's quite a complicated poem, actually. It looks quite simple, and I thought it was simple at first, but it's not.
This always happens when I have these conversations. There are poems that I think I know and sort of have, my own reading of, and then I speak with someone and it changes everything. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so different. It's really, what a great conversation with you. And I think it's changed a lot how I think about the plays, and it's changed the way I'm thinking about the space of the plays, because I'd always I'm really interested in the idea of the dancing body in these kinds of drawing rooms, and sort of Yeats trying to break down that sort of barrier between audience and dance. And my own experience of, I think this is an American, I don't know if it's a uniquely American thing, it's probably not, but often in the US, there's when we go to something like a performance or dance, it's very regimented in terms of spaces. Like the audience is supposed to behave in a certain way, and we sit there and we watch, and there's that kind of distance. And you're suggesting a kind of breaking down of those boundaries where the dancer is acting on us rather than just performing some kind of aesthetic for us, and that there's something subversive in the way that the dancer is influencing the audience as well, as opposed to us sitting in sort of mastery watching and waiting for the dance to become the sort of perfect symbol of unity. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about this poem, and a really good way of thinking about Yeats's dance play. So God, I've got a lot more to say about this when I teach it now.
Yeah,
That's great.
always like that with Yeats. I mean, even his very short dance plays, you know, a PhD is not enough. So
That's wonderful. Well, I really appreciate having the chance to talk with you today. So this was fantastic.
Cool.
I look forward to seeing you I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Yes. Me too.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.